Okay, so welcome back. Sorry I didn't get this one up yesterday, but it'll go up today, and hope to get another one up on Monday. One of the biggest areas, I think, of contemporary art is the arrival of what we would call outsider art. And what we mean by outsider art is this concept of expanded boundaries. That once we've kind of deconstructed the nature of art itself, and once we're willing to accept popular culture into art through the pop art movement and through several of the other movements, and art becomes fundamentally about ideas and not about construction or about execution, then that's a logical place to ask the question, so what are the limits to art? Where should art go? And is art something created by traditionally trained artists, or can art come from anywhere? And so there is a long tradition of what is known as folk art in America. But unlike other countries, this folk art ends up having a profound impact on the direction of art. Art can now come from outside sources. That's why we call it outsider art. And so things like folk art, non-traditional artists, artists who are not professionally trained, sources of primitivism become a major source of inspiration in contemporary art. And this ultimately leads us to street art and graffiti. Because street art and graffiti is the ultimate source, I think, of outsider art that has now become mainstream. So right from the beginning of modernism, we had characters such as Rousseau, who made the very famous Dream. This was an artist who was discovered by Picasso and was very influential on a great number of early modernist artists. This kind of French clerk who had no other formal training, but eventually, because of his latent primitivism and his latent, kind of simplicity, was achieving the kind of things that modernists wanted to achieve. But America also had its own tradition of primitivists, people like Grandma Moses, and a long tradition of folk artists. And these have been exceptionally influential as well. So if we look at, say, the paintings of Grant Wood, and during the Regionalist period, or even if we look at the periods of artwork by, say, Philip Guston, you can see this latent primitivism, this influence from folk art coming in. And while it definitely influenced early European modernism, I think it's in America that this outsider art becomes even more influential. And what makes an outside artist? Well, generally the person doesn't come up through the usual routes. So we have individuals like George Wiedner. George Wiedner would create works of art, in this case, this one's discussing the Hadron Collider. None of these artists are going to be professionally trained. Howard Finster was a preacher who ultimately came over to art and was using tractor paint on tin to create these pieces. And it is the untrained quality and the heavy kind of political kind of message that really carries these over. By far the most famous outside artist currently that had a lot of research done on him is Henry Darger. Henry Darger was this custodian in Chicago who, over the course of several decades, would clip out pictures of little girls from magazines and other things and recreate these into large illustrations on a work that was this massive, sprawling, epic, bizarre, surreal fantasy novel. There's no other way to describe it. The story is the story of the Vivian girls in what is known as the realms of the unreal, of the Glandokin-Angelinian war storm caused by the child slave rebellion, 15,000, which is the actual formal title of these pieces. So these pieces have a collage-like quality that he would create, and none of this was known until he died. There's been a whole documentary about Darger and his influence, how after he died this stuff became available, and there was all kinds of speculation that perhaps he was a pedophile. He was obsessed with a child murder that happened, and actually wrote several letters to the editor about it, and people wonder if he was in fact that child murderer. I think the thinking is now that he was not, that he was just this untrained artist that created whole vast worlds out of his own imagination using collage techniques, and techniques that are remarkably similar to what wound up being used in postmodernism. So there is a long tradition in America of outsider artists breaking into the mainstream or influencing the mainstream. But by far the most important tradition, I think, that has come about is graffiti and street art. Graffiti is a kind of outsider art that has gone mainstream by people who do not have any kind of traditional skills, but made a completely new art form. And not just a new art form, but a completely new way of expressing that art form. So graffiti starts really simply. According to legend, it starts with an individual by the name of Daryl McCrae, who went by the tag Cornbread, and he's regarded as the first graffiti writer. There were a number of... He was living in Philadelphia at the time, but there were a number of people who were doing very similar things. And what he was doing was putting up a pseudonym, this alias of his, this alter ego, of Cornbread, and splashing it in a stylized handwriting up along the walls in and around his neighborhood, his school, and etc. And what ended up happening was a really kind of dramatic event. Now, he certainly wasn't the only person who was doing this, but he became famous because of a stunt that he pulled. A young man with the first name of Cornelius was killed in a gang shooting, a drive-by shooting, and the press reported that this was the titular Cornbread. And his name was Cornelius, so they assumed he was Cornbread, and that Cornbread was dead. Well, Daryl McCrae knew that, no, that guy wasn't Cornbread, I was Cornbread. And the police and the authorities had been pursuing Cornbread for quite some time, trying to catch this vandal, and so he decided, well, I've got to prove I'm still alive and that I'm still me. So he actually pulled an incredible stunt, a stunt that got him put in jail. But he went into the Philadelphia Zoo, and he totally vandalized the Philadelphia Zoo with his rapid, stylized, handwriting, using spray paint. And he even spray painted Cornbread Lives right on the side of an elephant. So here's a print, and in this case, he's actually written his name, Cornbread Philly, on the print of this elephant. It's kind of funny. So this was a huge scandal, and this was when graffiti writing and the first kind of stage of this finally kind of pushed into the public consciousness. Well, the next major area that it took off was New York City. And so you had a few people like Tracy 168 who would go and write his name, his street name, his tag name, which is Tracy 168. And he would put it on signs and posts and many other things. And eventually he got brave enough to spray paint it on the side of subway cars. And so all throughout the 1970s, this trend accelerated. So here I'm going to get you a little bit into, graffiti terminology. Tagging is kind of the heart of graffiti art. A tag is a stylized name that you write. It's usually an alias or a name. It's done very quickly. You can see a variety of tags here. If you're no good at this, if you don't have this kind of unique style, you're called a toy, by the way. But if you really develop the style, you put your name everywhere. And it was about getting your name out there and getting it recognized. If you got a little braver, you would do things called throw-ups. Throw-ups were usually a two-color piece with bubble letters that was on top of the wall that were larger, usually 4 to 5 feet high. And then ultimately the thing that everybody wanted to achieve was wild style. And wild style was an incredible composition. Now these were done professionally at locations, but this is what wild style was. Wild style was typified by cartoon elements, really radical typography, beautiful stuff. It's kind of amazing. The most innovative things that are happening in typography were happening out on the streets and not in the world, while the rest of the world was moving towards Helvetica and getting dry and boring and dull. And calligraphy was dying out, and sign painting, all these beautiful lettering were dying out. I think almost that the reason that typography took over was because there was no other place for it to go. It's kind of interesting. Now we've lived long enough to see sign painting come back as an art form, but sign painting, which was very ubiquitous for ads and these beautiful hand-painted signs, disappeared in the 60s and 70s for print signs, and it just seems natural that native typography would emerge to take its place. So between Philly and New York, this nexus in Philly and New York, and then eventually it emigrated to the West Coast in places like Los Angeles, graffiti really took off, and it became more and more ubiquitous. It's kind of hard to imagine that cities didn't have this kind of graffiti much before the mid-70s. But by the 80s, it was everywhere in places in New York. All of the trains were covered in it. Of course, if you were a tagger, the idea behind tagging is to get your name out there. This is very much tied up in the personality and the personality and the ego of the artist who's creating this. And so putting it on a subway was ultimate, because then you could tag once, but it would be seen throughout the city as the trains went through. And if you've seen the latest Joker movie, you see a little taste of what this must have been like. Subway cars were absolutely covered in tags. And the reaction to graffiti was very mixed. While there was a great deal of kind of admiration and respect for these larger wild style pieces, most of it was going to be tagging or throw-ups on the scale like this, and most people regarded it as vandalism of public property, vandalism of private property, as a kind of an urban blight. And it was really out of hand by the time we entered the late 80s. Now, philosophically, I have to make the case for the other side. I mean, if you were a business owner and you were constantly trying to scrub or clean this off, as a matter of course, you could see that why this was a problem. It was expensive, it made things look run down, plus there was a gang element to it. A lot of these individuals were associated with gangs, and so this would spark off turf wars, that one person would come and tag, and then the gang culture would come by and see that tag and recognize that was a tag of a rival gang, and so they would have to tag that wall. So pretty soon you could start with a clean wall, but within a matter of days, the wall would be tagged by every gang in the area just to prove that they had control over that area. To put this in the best possible light from the perspective of the graffiti writers, you have to understand that the 70s and the 80s was a time of stagflation and economic downturn, particularly for inner city blacks, who most of these individuals were, and they saw this as a way of reclaiming spaces. And this was something that they said even then, that nobody asked us if we wanted these ads for cigarettes or other things, or these billboards placed in our communities. It was a commonplace that cigarette ads, liquor ads would pop up in these communities, and they made an argument that this was a kind of crime against their vision. No one asked them if they wanted these up, so they saw this as a kind of counter-protest. So on one level, this is teenage angst and teenage ego. On another level, it's part of the territorial culture of rival gangs. But there were quite a few people at the time making the case that no, this was an attempt to take back the visual space of our trains, our billboards, our cities that had been completely covered with posters and with advertisements. So it ties in a way, in a strong way, to the pop art movement, to the Nouveau Realism, that they were responding to this kind of idea of anti-consumerism. But it did reach a really kind of boiling point in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, we had a whole series of things known as the Graffiti Wars, which, interestingly enough, settled in Philadelphia. And this was I can take you back to the 1990s because I know I was there. I lived through it. I was actually in Philadelphia while this fight was going on. And it got really, really hot. And it turned into a debate. Who owns the public spaces? If a businessman wants to rent his wall, and there are plenty of open walls in Philadelphia, if he wants to rent his wall out to a billboard and advertise anything to the community, then who is he to have that right to control a public space just because it's private property? So there was this huge push to go against it. And a person by the name of Jan Golden came about, and she founded what was called the Anti-Graffiti Network in the 80s, where she tried to recruit graffiti artists who were gang members from Philadelphia, mostly from West and North Philadelphia, to paint murals instead. And the idea was that if you painted a mural was something that the community could believe in and would gather around. Whereas if it was graffiti, the graffiti just continued this kind of gang territorial culture. And the Anti-Graffiti Network eventually morphed into the Mural Arts program to the point where Philadelphia, which was kind of the birthplace of graffiti, became the home of this massive mural arts program. Philadelphia has more public murals than any other city in the world, and it's not even close. It's easily twice as many as any other major metropolitan environment. And it's really due to, the works of Jan Golden, who's right there, who I think was the director up until the mid-2000s. And then I think she moved on to other things. But I actually have a little bit of knowledge about this because I had a friend who was giving a paper at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania. This was partially sponsored by the Philadelphia Museum. And the paper, this was all about graffiti and public art, this argument that had erupted. And Jan Golden was there, and so was another student from Penn's art program, a student that I knew. I wasn't friends with this student. And this student had decided to do their thesis on gang memorials. And so what you're seeing here in the background is a gang memorial. What would happen is someone would die, get killed by a rival gang, and then someone who was an artist associated with the gang of the person who got killed would put up a memorial. And then these memorials would get very, very controversial. They would be very, very... let me put it this way. They would become hot zones for graffiti. So you have a person who gets killed by a rival gang. That person has a memorial put up in their honor that's a wild-style memorial. The rival gang that killed them is going to have every incentive to come back to this location and tag the original wild-style memorial. And then it just becomes an escalation over who claims this space and who has control over it. And if you have two gangs coming back to the same place to deface or to repaint a memorial, it's going to cause even more violence. So these graffiti memorials became a locus for continued violence. And so it would end up that a memorial, which usually memorialized the place the person was shot or killed, would act like a magnet for more shootings and more violence. And Jan Golden had a lot of data on this. She had enormous crime records. When she started this program, she started with the idea that she could work with the gangs, that the gangs she could kind of coach their instincts towards producing murals or things that would benefit the community. But she eventually said, no, that's not going to work. And so she instead started working against the gangs to bring in artists to create murals. Now, I wasn't there, but I know many people who were there. And at this conference, Jan Golden got into an absolute screaming, profanity-laced shouting match with this student who was doing this research. Because the student was, like all art historians, doing this as a course of study, and was doing a study on this, and was saying, no, this was a native form of expression. And of course, this became about race. How could it not? It became about race in the inner city. This was a native form of expression. And Jan Golden was like, no, these things are magnets for crime. And what she was advocating instead was that we paint over these memorials, and we turn these spaces into uplifting murals that show the community in a positive light. And I have to say that most of these murals have ended up being rather anodyne and kind of saccharine, but that was the intent. They were meant to build a community. Well, the graffiti community pushed back very, very hard on this, as you can imagine. This was one of the first murals painted, and here it is defaced. So the murals themselves started to become a player in this dynamic between the graffiti writers, the gangs, the muralists, etc. It eventually all sorted itself out, and this battle was happening all across America. It wasn't just Philadelphia. What do we do about graffiti? And this is also the time that Rudy Giuliani came to power in New York City. And Rudy Giuliani was very influenced by a very famous paper on sociology and criminology called The Broken Windows paper, which was written in part by James Wilson, and I forget the other scholar, that said that even small acts of vandalism, even small acts of lawlessness, if ignored, will lead to a culture of lawlessness. So the idea was, if you have broken windows in a neighborhood, people see that as a sign that nobody's taking care of the neighborhood, so even more things get broken. So what you have to do is you have to fix the broken windows right away. And what that means for graffiti is you have to accept a zero-tolerance policy for graffiti. You have to absolutely buff it out. And so, and for cities, the argument became clear. And quite frankly, small business owners who were tired of repainting their buildings rallied behind people like Jan Golden, rallied behind Rudy Giuliani, and most cities within a course of 5 to 10 years adopted a zero-tolerance policy, where if tagging goes up, it goes down within 24 hours. That the thing that pushes the graffiti, the thing that really moves the graffiti artist, that gets him to do that gets him to do this, is seeing his name up on that wall and that recognition. So the only way to stop that is to kill the incentive. The only way to kill the incentive is to get the graffiti off the wall as soon as possible. And so all major cities, New York, Philadelphia, LA, adopted a 24-hour buffing rule if the graffiti goes up, and they hired huge squads and got organized huge groups of volunteers to go and just paint over the graffiti as soon as possible. And it worked. And to be honest, it actually worked. There has been a rapid decrease in graffiti across the nation. There's been a rapid decrease of the associated crime that goes with the graffiti, which is good. And I'm split on this. I'll just tell you that, because it's obviously one of the more unique native movements of visual expression. Graffiti is an American invention. It's utterly unique. It belongs to America's inner city, particularly its inner city blacks, and it's been exported all the world. Everybody understands what this is and what it means. And it was a very powerful form of expression and a way for these people to take back their communities and to overcome a sense of hopelessness. And the illegality is part of the art form. That's something you can't ignore. That the fact that it's illegal, the fact that you are making a protest, that you are doing an illegal act as a revolutionary act, is part of the art form. There's no way to get around that. But I've also been a small business owner. I also own a house. I live in the ghetto of Provo. If I said that in Philadelphia, people would laugh. But I live in the part of Provo that people call the ghetto of Provo, but it's not. It's like the nicest ghetto in creation. But we have houses and abandoned houses in the area, and we have public walls, and we have taggers that come through all the time. And they're total toys. They don't know what they're doing. They're lousy at it. But anyhow, we don't have the kind of graffiti artists that they have in Philly or LA or New York. But they get painted over. They get painted over right away. And if you didn't, this would just encourage more. And I understand why communities have fully embraced this, and why they embraced the kind of more positive aesthetic of Jan Golden, because she has numbers on this that, every time a mural goes up, the community rallies behind it and really seeks to protect it from this tagging culture and build something around it. So you have, official and unofficial forms of public art. And I'll just tell you, as a matter of art criticism and art history, art historians are far more interested into the kind of native, spontaneous movements than they are in these kind of top-down community murals. And you can understand why. The community murals are nice. They're attractive. They're pretty. But they're meant to be very non-controversial. They're meant to be very conventional. So the truth is the graffiti wars were bitterly fought in the 1990s, and the graffiti artists lost. They really were shut out. In New York City, they made the rule that a subway car, if the subway car was graffitied in the lot, it would not go out that morning until it was buffed, until it was either power washed clean or painted over. And so there was no point in painting subway cars anymore because no one would ever see them. But by this time, the style had really developed into a really dynamic feature with all of these graffiti writers. And so the graffiti writers weren't going to stop. They started looking for other venues. And you start to see people realizing, well, the most important thing is to get your art up there and get it seen. But if it's going to be buffed in 24 hours, there's no point in doing that. So what you do is you go find places where it's not going to be buffed in 24 hours. And there was a change, and the change began really in the early 2000s. And the change moved to, but it also began in the 80s, to finding abandoned locations, to working together with communities and businesses. Many graffiti artists went to businesses and said, hey, you got a blank wall, how about I do an ad for you? But we'll do it in a wild style. And people they love the wild style, they love the mural style, etc. And this was very controversial in the graffiti community because, again, the illegality is part of the art. How can you claim you're doing something revolutionary and taking back the streets if, you're cooperating with a small businessman who might otherwise paint your thing over to put up a billboard or just some advertisement? And so you see that a lot of these graffiti artists tried to go commercial. They tried to go into galleries. Other graffiti artists called them as sellouts. Another alternative was to find abandoned buildings. And so all over America, abandoned buildings that were eyesores anyway were started to be large-scale canvases for graffiti artists. The biggest and most important of these is Five Points. Five Points was an abandoned factory in New York City. And for the better part of 20 years, it became a kind of mecca for graffiti writers. And graffiti writers would come there. It would be painted and repainted. You can see this lower wall here. And one of the natures of graffiti art is you own the art, but you don't own the wall. Which means that if you paint a wall, that doesn't mean it's going to be there. If another artist comes along and paints over it and creates something dynamic, that's part of the art form. You have to create something that's so spectacular that people don't want to paint it over. But if you do create something, it had better be good, because otherwise somebody will come around and repaint it. And so you can see here, this piece here actually was repainted. And so here's a shot from it later that has this large piece of wild style that's been added. You can see that some of these pieces are the same. This kind of face right there is the same. But the walls have been changed. So this thing was really, in a way, one of the largest rotating and changing galleries in America. It was this constantly rotating gallery of art. In fact, this mural that you can see here is the same as this mural here, but you can see that this mural was changed. And it got really sophisticated. Some neat stuff were being produced. It's also important to comment, all of this is being done with spray paint. The graffiti artists are just absolute technical masters to render out, and they would mix realistic things with artwork. They would mix it with texts. If you read the text behind this figure, you get a sense of the depth of the culture that would go on. Here's one of Biggie Smalls and this gigantic mural of a tiger. So some of this actually was more than just tagging. A lot of this was more than just pictures being put up. It was actually an attempt to really create provocative art. And let me tell you, it's not hard to spray. It's not easy to spray paint like this. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, I'll talk to you about it sometimes. But now there are whole spray paint companies that exist just to supply graffiti writers. That there were graffiti writers who realized, man, this Krylon, spray paint is crap. And so there's Montana paints and a few others that exist just to serve the graffiti art market. And it's become a business. And so while the true diehards still believe in this quality, this revolutionary act, this egalitarian equality of the graffiti art, that you don't own a wall, you just own the art, and any wall goes up. And there's a few diehards like that, but a lot of them have gone commercial, and a lot of them are doing that. I mean, you have to do what you can, and painting on an abandoned building was a way to do that. So what's interesting is that this lasted for so long. For nearly 20 years, 5 Points was a kind of mecca of graffiti art, and it was respected. The person who owned the building, they had a kind of tacit agreement with the graffiti artists that as long as the building remained undeveloped, they could actually let it happen. And then even it kind of came crashing down in 2015, I think. In 2015, the owner of the building started making noises that he had a buyer for the building. The building was going to be demolished, and it was going to be sold, and it was going to be redeveloped. And he was telling people that, okay, we're going to paint over this. And everybody was like, no, it's, come on, it can't happen. And this is where things got really difficult, because there is no centralized graffiti authority. There isn't like, okay, guys, we've had a good run. Let's stop it now. It's not going to happen. And so how do you stop a movement where the whole movement is, by design, engaging in what is technically illegal or, vandalism? And so eventually it reached a point where the owner of the company just decided to buff the whole building. And they came in and buffed the whole thing, painted over all of the walls, and put up a chain link fence. And this caused an uproar, because by this point, the graffiti wars having been lost in the 90s, communities weren't being inundated with graffiti again. Graffiti had kind of been elevated in status. This is also the time when street art and urban art was becoming really important and was coming onto public consciousness. And so this caused a huge scandal in the art community. How could this person do this? How could this person destroy what was probably regarded the most interesting and native pieces of outsider art to exist? There were many high-profile critics and high-profile names in the art community who came out and protested this. But of course, and what's funny is the guy was like, hey, it's my building. I can do what I want. You guys have no legal standing. But that turned out not to be true. Because in the early 2000s, because of the rise of street art and guerrilla art, a very, very austere law, an amazingly austere law, was passed in New York City. And this law said that artists had rights to their public art. There was a number of famous works of art that were moved from locations. You remember the Tilted Arc that we talked about by Richard Serra. And there was a feeling that artists were removed, that public art in the public sphere was removed or damaged or changed, and this changed context. And so they wrote a very broad law with very strict penalties saying that no artists have rights to their art even in public spaces. So when this was painted over, a community of graffiti writers actually sued the owner of 5 Points. And they won. They won like a $5 million settlement. It was insane. They won a $5 million settlement because they owned rights to public art. And under the law, because he had allowed them to continue to paint on the site, that they had a kind of easement to the property, and they had rights to their art. And so he has been slapped with a $5 million judgment to pay these graffiti artists. Now, it's absurd. How on earth could you ever pay the graffiti artists? Because there's not any one graffiti artist. Artists from all over the world were coming to paint at 5 Points. So it's kind of absurd. How could you make this work? There's no way that you can make this work. And it's being challenged in court. But it shows that we've entered a new territory that, from just a few years earlier, where buffing had become the standard policy for every city, we are now in the point where the government of New York is ordering damages being paid out to graffiti artists for what happened at 5 Point. And this shows us that we've entered into a really interesting place. It demonstrates that street art has really arrived, that it has broken into the mainstream. But still, it becomes this big battle. Who owns public spaces? How do you deal with this? Can you do this without the illegality of it? Can you do this without being a sellout? And so you see graffiti writers doing all kinds of experimental things now. Now they do cellophane graffiti, where what you do is you take plastic wrap and you wrap it between two poles or two trees, and you paint that. And I actually had a friend who was a graffiti artist, and he was telling me that, when I would paint something in Provo, Provo has graffiti artists, he said it was almost always painted within 48 hours. It just disappeared. But when he started doing cellophane graffiti, where he's painting on these plastic-wrapped poles, he says, I wouldn't tell anybody I was doing it. I wouldn't get permission to do it. I would just do it. And he said, and it would stay up for 2 weeks. Because the difference is that when it's plastic, everybody knows it's not going to be there forever. And so street artists have changed their strategy. Their strategy has changed from one of being adversarial to being one of trying to win the public over. So what started as a kind of revolutionary act of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s turned into a kind of a dance where we will try to find ways to accommodate the public. And there's been all kinds of experiments with this. One of my favorite ways is what's called negative graffiti, where instead of painting on a wall, what you do is you clean a wall. There are plenty of places in the urban landscape where grease and grime and dirt has been spread, and now what they'll do is they'll clean back the wall to create trees, or in this case to create skulls. What's funny is sometimes this is done in a act of activism. I know that in this case, this tunnel here had been filthy for years, and the artist wiped away the grime to paint this kind of thing of skulls in this tunnel, and he did it as a kind of protest, as a way of forcing the government to clean the tunnels. And they did. They came by with a power washer and cleaned it all off, so that you couldn't see it. But they couldn't get him for a crime because he's not technically damaging anything. He's merely cleaning off what's there. So a lot of things happened to transform graffiti writing into a different kind of art form. But of course, the biggest strategy of all is just being clever. The biggest strategy is finding ways to capture the public's imagination or attention in a way that is humorous or funny, or perhaps has more social consciousness, and just gets people to come along with it. I love this one because in this case, the artist DS, he put up a stencil, and this immediately got buffed, and he happened to capture a photo of the person who buffed it off, and then the very next day he came in, and he put a stencil of the guy who buffed it off right up on the wall. That's clever. That's very, very clever. And so you could see how the strategy changes. So somewhere in the 1990s, and there's no hard date on this, somewhere on the hard 1990s, we have a shift. We have a shift from what we call graffiti writing to street art. And you can see the shift happening. It actually begins earlier than that. And what happens is that it changes. That is, there's this acknowledgement, and it changes its focus. It changes its focus from graffiti writing. Graffiti writing is fundamentally about two things. It's about the name and the identity of the graffiti writer, getting his name up there, getting the recognition, and then it's about the uniqueness of his skill in manipulating typography and spray paint and all of this. And there was a trend towards, okay, well, that stuff is going to get buffed off. So how do we put stuff up that doesn't get buffed off? And the way you do it is by trying to find a sweet spot where the public is going to accept it. So you look for something that's more socially conscious, something that's more acceptable. It's interesting that street art gets less revolutionary, less of a fight against the system, and more of a kind of social commentary, and it becomes more activist. So it becomes more about issues than personality or territory. It still plays on the ideas of irony and anti-consumerism. Anti-consumerism has always been a part of graffiti art. That was one of the major pushes, is to take back streets that have been plastered over with advertising and make them about the people who are actually living on the streets. There's also going to be a change in technique. There's going to be, as buffing got better and better, and as more and more of these things got taken down, it turns out it takes a lot of time to spray paint up these huge wild style pieces. And so people started moving to stencils and wheat paste posters. We also have the introduction of what's called culture jamming. That is that you would take existing advertisements and tweak them. You wouldn't change the whole thing. You would find ironic ways to do things. And all of these are quicker. All of these are faster. Something you could do like that in a matter of minutes instead of spending 30 minutes to several hours working on a wild style piece. And that's very important because this is done illegally. And if you get caught, you're in big trouble. And we start to see this happen even before the graffiti wars. And one of the principal players in this is Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat's a New Yorker who was of mixed Puerto Rican and Haitian descent, who immigrates to the United States. And he starts out as one of these graffiti artists. But he was a different kind of graffiti artist. And he's probably the first one to actually find this sweet spot that appeals to people's sensibilities. He started working under the tag Samo. Now, the truth is, Samo was never ever one person. He was the primary player in this, but he had a few friends who were doing this. And this is actually true of a lot of graffiti tags. They're not all one person sometimes. Sometimes they're a crew. And if you have a crew going around, and the crew can fan out over the city, that brings more recognition and fame to the name, and that's what your goal is. So it's really kind of a fascinating present. It's kind of like the Dread Pirate Roberts, you never die, you just keep going. And there's several tags now that have been going for 30, 40 years, and the idea that this is the same, that some guy in his 60s is out there on the billboards and spray painting things on the overpass, probably not the case. It's probably been passed down through to several people so that the name can continue to go on. So a group of friends got together and they used this tag Samo. But most people give the credit for the genius. While this is not exclusively Basquiat, they give the credit to him. And he would paint these really different things. While everybody else was painting tags or things or slogans, he started painting these very ironic, these very wry kind of messages. And this is one of my favorites, which says, "Which of the following is omnipresent?" And of course he uses the fun spelling that taggers use, which is Lee Harvey Oswald, Coca-Cola logo, General Melonry, or Samo. And, and then the thing that really captured the imagination of New Yorkers is that he put a copyright symbol. So this was a way of dealing, this is really clever. Because, of course, copyright is this thing that indicates that this is a brand name. And so he put the copyright symbol behind it. And he started painting these, and he started painting these in and around Manhattan. Well, in the early 80s, if you were living in Manhattan and you were a Upper East Side kind of elite who was into the art scene, this was very clever. This was different than the usual tagger. This was somebody who was thinking, who was making commentary. And immediately, right away, this got him noticed. Now, back then, you couldn't, in the 80s, you couldn't make a career as a street artist. It was not going to work. So Basquiat started moving into galleries. And this is where he kind of moved into what we call a neo-expressionist phase, painting in a style that is neo-expressionist. This is 50 Cent piece. It has all these kind of, machinations. But even when you look at this, it has the kind of energy that you would expect from the street, from this outsider energy. So the first real artists who were outsider street artists who crossed didn't really make their careers on the street. The street was what got them introduced to people, but they moved into gallery work, and that's how they made their career. The other famous one, of course, is Keith Haring. Keith Haring was this artist in New York who realized that when they finished with an advertising run in the subway, they would come over and just paint the thing over black. Or they would just put black paper over the top of it if they didn't have another ad to go to. And he realized these made perfect places for quick little sketches. So he started doing these quick little chalk and oil paint sketches, oil pastels, just very, very quickly. And he developed a whole series of kind of recognizable icons. The glowing baby and the mushroom cloud was a famous one. The three-eyed man was a famous one. The barking dogs. And these simple little things were very quick, very easy to draw, something he could do in a matter of minutes and walk away. But because he was using the subways and putting these in the subways, they were also ubiquitous. But because they were on these blacked out posters, they weren't seen as the same kind of vandalism as, say, graffiti writing. And it charmed people. It charmed people to the degree that they began to recognize this. And so he then came out into galleries, starting doing commissioned murals. He is wearing a t-shirt with his very famous three-eyed man, which was one of his kind of quick doodles. And then he moved on to murals, and he was very, very active as a gay individual. He was very active in the AIDS crisis, asking people to speak up and fight it. And so these two characters, Basquiat and Haring, were really some of the very, very first street artists to elevate the concept of street art, but they did so by bringing it into the gallery. Unfortunately, both of them died young. Basquiat really couldn't handle his fame and fortune. His sudden fame and fortune died of a heroin overdose in 1988, and Haring died of AIDS-related complicated diseases in 1990. But it showed that the fact that these two guys, who were essentially just street artists, found their way into the gallery culture and were elevated to the gallery culture, it really shows that the world was looking for something new. The world was looking for something authentic, and you couldn't find it in the gallery, and so they were looking to it for the street. But in the 80s, it was still important enough to move it to the gallery in the minds of most art critics. That is, you couldn't just have it living on the street. Maybe it could start on the street, but it was going to end in the gallery. But we see a shift happening in the 90s, where there is a shift away from galleries. And in fact, there are street artists that regard Basquiat and Haring as kind of sellouts for that reason, that they didn't stay in the street and they didn't continue in the street. One of the other artists that starts at this time and is very influential, but seemingly, kind of forgotten now, was Blek Lerat, who was a French artist. And he was also a street artist doing stuff like this, but he was one of the first to actually go to stencils. Again, the idea being It's very, very hard to do something very quick, but a stencil allows you to put up the stencil, spray paint it very quick. You could do multiple layers of stencils to produce layers of color, and he started producing these figures. Now, he was doing this in Paris, and so he took on the title Bec le Rat. And the reason he took on the title is because he said rats were the only thing that were ubiquitous. He was trying to create an image that everybody in Paris could understand. And he said, rats are ubiquitous in Paris. And they are, and they still are. Same in New York City. It's true of all big cities. You can't get rid of them. And so it became a perfect symbol for somebody who was an underground artist, somebody who was trying to demonstrate and achieve ubiquity through his images. But then he also branched out to, ballet dancers and other things, and kind of, stencils of homeless people, stencils of sheep, and all kinds of things. And at about the same time, and the funny thing is that he really kind of had to end his career because he got arrested, and he kind of gave up his career, and but people knew about him, and then he actually came back in the 2000s when the street art phenomenon took off. But he wasn't really known much outside of Paris in the 80s and 90s. The first street artist to achieve a kind of international stardom for what he did on the street is going to be Shepard Fairey. So Shepard Fairey was an artist. He was actually going to art school in Rhode Island, I think. And he was going to art school in Rhode Island, but he came out of L.A., and this is when he did his, kind of obey Andre Has a Posse campaign. He was going in the opposite direction. He was saying, okay, well, instead of doing stencils or spray paint, he was doing wheat posters. That is, he was trying to print out stickers or paper, and then you would take wheat paste. Wheat paste is a very old technology. They were using wheat paste to put up posters in the 19th century. And you paint the wheat paste right over the top of the paper, and it's transparent, and it kind of waterproofs it. It's very, very durable. And so he was making stickers, he was doing wheat posters, and all these kind of things. And he had a friend who was really trying to get into the scene. He was actually off school and was doing it. And his friend said, well, I don't know what to do. And he says, oh, just do anything. And so he said, here, I'll show you. And so he pulled out a newspaper, and the newspaper was had a thing for WrestleMania on it. And Andre the Giant was one of the most prominent figures of wrestling of the time. So he just made a photostatic copy of that, turned that into a sticker, and produced that, and started pasting it around the city. And it was kind of obscure. Nobody really knew what it meant. But for whatever reason, it started to gather a lot of attention. And this is in the early 90s, so this is the early, early days of the internet, and this is a very, very important feature of this. That street art would not exist without the internet. I'm absolutely convinced of this. That the street art begins to grow because the internet comes along. Because people can share through these forums and other things, hey, I saw this weird sticker, what is that? And this thing started to take on a life of its own. And Shepard Fairey, to his credit, even though there was nothing, it was just done to prove a principle. It wasn't really done to create something, but he recognized he had something with him. So he simplified this. He simplified the face of Andre the Giant down into this schematic face, and then he put the words obey under it. And the obey comes from a movie by John Carpenter. John Carpenter made a movie, and this movie starred Rowdy Roddy Piper, who was another famous wrestler. And in the movie, there are aliens taking over the world, and they have placed subliminal messages into all the advertisement. And Roddy Piper's character finds a pair of glasses that allows him to see the aliens and to see the subliminal messaging. So he took that, and much of the subliminal messaging says obey. So he borrowed that from the movie and just started plastering the city with these kind of images and these kind of forms. And it took off. It's often cited as one of the first original memes. A meme is a term invented by Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a biologist, and he said he thought that there had to be a term for the propagation of an idea, because he was a geneticist and dealt with biology, and he said, it's in biology we have a thing called a gene, that is the propagation of information. He says, but we ought in the modern society need to have a term for a self-propagating idea. And so he borrowed that term from ancient Greek and came up with the word meme. And now memes are ubiquitous. But at this time they weren't ubiquitous. A meme is something that generates its own energy, it generates its own attention, and then gets copied. And Shepard Fairey has admitted this. He said, there wasn't. He says he's probably not responsible for even a tenth of the obey stickers and posters that went up, but by creating such a recognizable image, and once the image achieved a certain purchase on the public's imagination, it just took off from there. And he did a lot of other fun things. I'm not going to belabor this because I think that this is probably the most significant thing he ever did. But he also did, he would do posters of... there was a mayor running for Providence while he was there, and he was corrupt, and so he was doing a whole series of memes on him. A lot of funny, kind of interesting stuff. He's most famous today, of course, for making the Hope poster, which, the Hope and Change posters for the Obama campaign in 2008. But he also does a series of walls and murals. He's very influenced by propaganda images. In fact, he often looks to images of, constructivists, Rodchenko and Lazitsky and other Russian constructivists who were doing propaganda for the Soviet system, for the Bolsheviks. And he takes it and he uses it kind of wryly and ironically to create these things. Interestingly enough, he was himself caught up in a scandal because the Hope and Change posters he ripped off of a Associated Press photographer. Now, he changed it, of course. He posterized it, gave it a color, etc., but he got into trouble because he denied having copied it. He said, no, I didn't copy it, not me. I totally came up with it independently. And it's obvious he just lied about it. And I don't know why he felt the need to lie. I guess if it seems to me that the person who understands the importance of repetitive imagery could have just said, yeah, I stole it, so what? I changed it, I made it my own. And I think had he done that, he would have been fine. But because he denied it, he got himself into trouble and got a judgment against him. But it's kind of interesting. That's the nature of images. It's not really about the artist anymore. It's about the image. And while, Shepard Fairey and some of these other artists have gone into galleries, their most important work is, achieving this kind of ubiquity through their work. And that brings us to Banksy. So Banksy is probably the most famous street artist today, and so I have to talk about him, even though I don't want to. Banksy was a graffiti writer. He was one of these graffiti writers. He was working in Bristol, England, as a British guy. And it's pretty certain his name was it Randall Gunningham? He's kind of been outed. He still tries to go by, the name Banksy. Banksy was his tagger name, and Banksy is a local term for crazy. And according to legend, he said, I was doing spray paint, and I got caught by a cop, and I ran, and I was hiding under a tanker truck, and I was looking up at the bottom of the tanker truck thinking there's got to be a quicker way to do this so I don't get caught. And he noticed there was a stencil on the tanker trunk, and he said, that's it. I'll use stencils. Well, of course, that's a complete lie. Almost certainly he got the ideas of stencils from Blake Lerat. In fact, when we look at some of his works, he often uses rats. So this is a Banksy rat here. The theme of rats is something he stole from Blake Lerat as well. It's one thing you have to know about Banksy is Banksy lies about everything. And we do have some of his earlier graffiti pieces. He was kind of a graffiti writer, but very quickly he realized if he did something that was a little bit more socially acceptable or a little bit more humorous, he could garner the public attention and, more importantly, garner the public sympathy. So here's one of his earlier pieces, Girl with Balloon. This is one of his funnier pieces. I could only find a close-up after it had been later kind of damaged. This is... the idea is that this man is having an affair with this woman. The husband comes home and he is hiding out. But he has, I have to say this, he has a very clever sense of space. He has a very clever sense of taking existing spaces and using stencils to create images that fit very well in situ, in the context that we find them. And he also had a real fun sense of, kind of popular culture, taking characters from Pulp Fiction and putting bananas in their hands, and etc. And he managed to hit this perfect sweet spot between socially conscious rebellion and middle-brow sensibilities. What I mean by that is, had his stuff been any more radical or offensive or really edgy, people wouldn't have put up with it. They'd have, painted it over in a heartbeat. And he really was looking to be liked. He really was trying to find this sweet spot where people would look at his stuff and say, oh, that's clever, and yet socially conscious and in a way that they could kind of justify it. So his works in Bristol really kind of transformed the concept of street art. A lot of his early stuff got painted over, but again, in comes the internet. People started sharing pictures of these things. They said, oh, look at this little clever piece, and you have this little clever piece of a person sweeping up and lifting up the wall to sweep under the wall. Or you have a rioter. Rioters were actually kind of common in London at the time, but instead of the rioter throwing a Molotov cocktail, he's throwing a bouquet of flowers. So I guess this kind of message of revolutionary, but it embraces kind of peace. And this was seen as very, very clever, and it kind of made his career. And he's ridden this as far as he possibly can. In 2007, he was one of the first to actually go outside of his kind of traditional area of comfort by going to a location to do a particular work of art. A hot button issue at the time was the separation wall. This is the wall built between Israel and the Palestinian territories. And it was a wall where, quite frequently, individuals would have to be frisked before they could cross over to their jobs. Even though Palestinians live in this walled-off area, a lot of them still work in Israel. So they would have to cross and be frisked and inspected. And so he inverted this by putting up this stencil of an Israeli soldier instead being frisked by a little girl. So this has obvious, kind of political ramifications, but it's also very cute. And so he gets by being very cute and clever. Here's another one where he, was playing on the idea of the 2012 Olympic Games in London and the recent riots. So you have a rioter stealing one of the Olympic rings, and here he is doing a series. And back in 2013, he did what he called his New York residency, where he went to New York City and did a bunch of graffiti in New York City. This was one of the pieces that he did. What's interesting is that Banksy has, it's funny because Banksy is by far the most famous graffiti artist, not graffiti artist. I should not say graffiti artist. If you said Banksy was a graffiti artist, graffiti writers prefer the term writing because it's fundamentally about the typography. But they absolutely hate Banksy, as you can tell. They absolutely despise the man. They think he's a sellout. They think he's a fraud. And most of his works in New York City, which is the home of a lot of graffiti writing, instantly destroyed his stuff. So here he is kind of making a commentary on buffing and on the impermanent nature of street art, because he says what we do in life echoes in eternity, and then you have this buffer who's wiping off the writing. But it's rather ironic that long before the buffers got to his work, other graffiti artists got and absolutely destroyed it. And so Banksy is seen by graffiti writers and by other street artists as being bougie, as being thoroughly middlebrow, as being somebody that someone who is of the bourgeois class considers to be radical. He's really hit that sweet spot that he's radical enough to be edgy and fun, but comfortable enough that he's approachable. And so he's branched out quite a bit. You have to give him credit for being a heck of a self-marketer. He did a film called Exit Through Gift Shop, where eventually it showed at the Sundance Film Festival. So we have to comment that there are Banksys in Utah. And so at the Sundance Film Festival, he did this piece, which has a person filming a flower. And so this is his commentary that on kind of film and independent film that, about the nature of destruction of beauty. What's interesting is that now this piece, which itself was a piece of vandalism, is now under bulletproof glass because it was vandalized. So if you're lucky enough to get a Banksy on a brick wall, heck, take a sledgehammer to it and take the bricks out and go sell them. And he's since moved on to kind of more experimental stuff. That's this very kind of derivative anti-consumer stuff. He did this Dismal Land. He's done a whole installation back at the Jerusalem Wall. But here you can see you have the Little Mermaid, but she's glitching. We have a very kind of dreary Cinderella castle and a police riot van with a slide. And of course, I'm sure you've probably heard of his very famous recent stunt where he tried to sell an original print with a frame, but built into the frame was a shredding machine so that as it sold, it was going to be shredded. Of course, creating a work and it's got stuck halfway through, but having a work of art destroyed like this, it's just, again, his stuff is clever. I'll give it to him. It's clever, but it's only just clever, in my opinion. I think there's a lot more important work going out there in street arts and in street art and in urban art in general. And genuinely, you can't find a more reviled character in the area of street art than Banksy. He's seen as a complete and total sellout, and I think for obvious reasons. For many obvious reasons. He's just edgy enough to make it with the art crowd, but he's not real or authentic enough. And he's a noted liar. He claims he invented the stencil. He claims that he did all these things. And the truth is, all of this was invented beforehand. Okay. So, another artist that I actually think is more consequential and is a more important artist is Ron English. Ron English is an American artist who was really engaged in what we call culture jamming. In fact, I think he pretty much single-handedly invented it. And what he did is he took advertising, and you can see that he took on culture itself by putting up posters or painting signs and subverting consumerist imagery. Here you can see that he's put diabetic Coke instead of Diet Coke. He's taken the idea of 7-Eleven and turned it into 9-11. And I love that he was one of the first to actually paste over billboards. And he would make these billboards so close to the original advertising that it actually took people a while to realize that the ad had been changed. He would modify an existing ad or put up a poster. So here you have Forever Cool, which is an advertisement for cigarettes, but instead it shows a person's feet with a toe tag in a morgue. Joe Camel was very popular in the 90s and early 2000s, and it was discovered that that this was essentially the cartoon characters were being used by cigarette companies to market to kids. So he said, okay, we'll lampshade it for you. There it is, Camel Kids right there. He has a long-standing battle with McDonald's, putting up signs about McDonald's, making fun of McDonald's and the nature of McDonald's art. And what's interesting is that people say, so why did you do this? And he said, well, I actually tried to rent the billboards, but the companies wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let me because they knew that I would put up these kind of anti-commercial things, and they didn't want to get sued and be on the hook. So a lot of this he had to do illegally because places like Clear Channel and other billboard and advertising companies wouldn't let him put up these kind of ads. Also kind of fit into this mold is Cause. Cause is a street artist who, one day found a key that was a key to bus shelter ads. And he was amazed to discover that the key is a universal key, that it opens not just one bus shelter ad, but all of them. So he made up a kind of logo of himself, this character, and started putting it over the face of these existing bus shelter ads in New York City. And later kind of expanded this and marketed this to the point that this character that he's invented, which is clearly a kind of cross and skull and crossbones, excuse me, a skull and crossbones take on Mickey Mouse, to kind of appropriate that figure. Now he has huge inflatable figures, and again, much like Banksy, he's turned himself into a kind of commercial interest. I recently saw that he has an augmented reality program, so if you want, you can take the Cause figure and put it into augmented reality like Pokemon Go. Well, this stuff is kind of fun, and I really, I do kind of enjoy the more clever of Banksy stuff. I think there's much more important artists out there who are doing much more socially conscious work. And I think one of the most important is JR. JR is a Parisian, but he's a Parisian of, I believe, partially Algerian descent. And in the early 2000s, there was a series of riots in Paris. Now, it's kind of funny because in America, it's the inner cities that are filled with urban strife, and it's the suburbs that are kind of gentrified. But it's the exact opposite in Paris. In Paris, you have a kind of inner city where, gentrified bourgeoisie live, and it's the suburbs, the banlieue, that are filled with kind of poorer individuals. And a series of riots broke out. There was a massive spate of car burnings, and most of these individuals were of African or North African descent, and they were painted very negatively in the press. So JR was a photographer. He often calls himself a photographeur, who realized that no one was actually seeing or dealing with these people as they were, that they were in fact stereotyped, and that the way they showed up on the media was always terribly stereotyped. So he decided to take photographs of people from his community, and he took these photographs and printed them out on massive sheets of paper. And all over Paris and the inner cities of Paris, there are little niches or walls that are, primed for these kind of large-scale prints. And he printed them, and of course some of them showed them as humorous, some as serious, and he posted these all over the inner city of Paris, and people were really captivated by this, and it did actually achieve what he hoped it would achieve. This is called the Portrait of a Generation, that it made people think of the people living in the banlieue as real people, as opposed to this kind of stereotypical juvenile delinquent that was being portrayed in the media. So this started off his career, and of course in Paris they loved this kind of socially conscious street art, and it's socially conscious in a true and sincere way, not just kind of trying to hit this ironic sweet spot like Banksy, but really genuinely, earnestly trying to move the needle. This caused him to go to the separation wall between Israel and Palestine and started his face-to-face series, where he took photographs of Jews, photographs of Christians, photographs of Muslims, and he posted them up on the separation wall. And again, doing this illegally, he never got real permission to do this. And what was interesting is, as he was doing this, he was trying to build a sense of community. What he was trying to say is that, we're all humans, and he got humans to make all these goofy faces to show their humanity. As he was putting these up on the walls, certain individuals in certain neighborhoods, he says, well, we don't mind if you put up pictures of, if it was a Jewish neighborhood, they would say the Jews, and if it was an Arab neighborhood, they said, or Muslims. And he said, okay, well, I'll do that if you can tell me who the Jews and who the Muslims are. And they couldn't tell. And so, which was part of the point of this kind of display, as he wanted to prove that humanity is closer to each other than we realize, that in many cases they couldn't tell who were Arabs and who were Jews and who were Muslims and who were Christians and who were Jews. It was all mixed together. And he since then began on a series of, I think, really interesting, fascinating pieces. He went into the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, these kind of vertical slums, and he discovered that they were in fact very vibrant places, and that women played an important role in kind of keeping them together. And he wanted people to be able to see the people inside the houses. So he got permission to take these pictures of these women. And this was a series that he did all over the world. He started here, but he did it many places all over the world, highlighting the plights of women and the causes of women, and putting their faces on these buildings at monumental scale. He tends to work at a very large and monumental scale. And his recent work has kind of course, dealt with the issues of immigration and the border. He was wondering what to do, and he actually took a photograph of a little girl who was, in her cradle or her crib, leaning out over the top of it, and he thought that was perfect. So he built this large structure and positioned it so that she was looking out over the wall. And of course, here you have the Border Patrol agents. Again, a way of giving this a human scale, of bringing attention to the issues of the border. Another artist who does similar things is Candy Chang. Candy Chang is an artist who very much wants to create interactive places. And this was her very famous Before I Die series. So after Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of the Ninth Quarter in New Orleans, she found this abandoned building and started taking abandoned buildings. She did this in many cities, but it started here, and turning them into chalk murals with a very simple stencil that said, "Before I die, I want to." And then asking people to contribute. And these became real places where people could come together to express themselves. So street art, far from being kind of controversial or adversarial, has been demonstrated that it can actually bring people together and build communities. There's still incredible tension between the artists and the communities. A lot of communities have now reached out to urban artists to say, hey, we want you to come in and create spaces that we can, that'll build us and bring together. But there is still, if you're a street artist, you want your independence. You want some of this is done with permission, some of this is not done with permission. And so, again, this idea of, in order for it to be authentic, you don't own the street. You may own the work of art, but you don't own the street. And the whole nature of street art is that it's ephemeral in nature. It's changing, it's dynamic, like the street itself. I think it's really fascinating that some of the most exciting stuff going on in art today is actually happening not in our galleries. That our galleries have become, quite frankly, moribund, with the same kind of tropes and themes coming about. The most exciting stuff, I think, is happening on the street. And again, you really have to credit the internet and social media, because internet and social media become the memory of the street. Because the artwork is being buffed, because it's temporary. Even an installation like this is temporary. It's going to be removed. The internet becomes the memory for it and allows it to transfer to cultures and transfer to other people who say, wow, that's really good, I like that, and gives it a place and achieves the kind of ubiquity that Andy Warhol and other artists were always looking for, but I think can achieve it in a very positive way. To people who say that contemporary art is all about nihilism, or it's all about the ego of the artist, I would point them to street art, that a lot of street art is very socially conscious and very beautiful, and not just kind of beautiful conceptually, but beautiful in its execution. Some of the largest, most impressive works of art are being created today, and it's even Banksy Cause and Ron English are mostly clever, but even this is certainly a more fun to see on the eye than perhaps graffiti, but. At any rate, that's a good place to stop. That one went a little long, but thanks for hanging in there. We'll post another lecture. I do want to talk about global and identity art going forward. I'll post another little shorter lecture, I promise, on Monday. We have our last presentations on Monday. And of course, sometime next week, we're going to open up the final, and I'll definitely give a review of what I'm looking for in the final. Thanks so much, and as always, Hang in there.